Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice. Welcome to today's episode on what's holding you back from being mindful. Are you concerned about not being able to, quote unquote, clear the mind or practice mindfulness, quote unquote, the right way?
Do you have an aversion to the word mindfulness? Does it make you anxious or feel like a failure?
Do you have some reasons why you think mindfulness is not right for you?
Or do you think you simply can't do it?
Do you carry guilt that you don't have enough time to devote to mindfulness for it to be effective? The intention of today's episode is to help address all of those questions and also to help you realize that mindfulness is accessible to anyone, anytime, anywhere, doing or not doing anything at all. And similar to our yoga episode, I want to remind everyone that mindfulness is a way of being. And humans in general, all of us humans, we are capable of being mindful. And so I wanted to share one particularly lovely definition from mindful.org, which is a huge resource for practicing mindfulness and all things mindful. Mindfulness is the basic human ability to be fully present, aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us.
And that definition is so simple. I think so many of us make mindfulness complicated. And I just wanted to reflect as we start off that I consider both you and I mindful, and yet the way we practice mindfulness is completely different. And so I often say, and I don't know what you think about this, but I say that you're the formal mindfulness person and I'm more the informal, practical mindfulness person. And at the outset, I wanted to point out that I would say we both find benefit with what we do, and we both have many different ways and approaches of practicing mindfulness that people can benefit from. And so while I have this prejudice, I think that our world has made mindfulness complicated and you have to do it in this way, and there's all these different formal ways of practicing, that you can benefit from mindfulness even without any fancy, as simply as pausing, slowing down, breathing, being aware, or doing one pose such as mountain pose or sitting with your legs crossed.
I appreciate that distinction. Then I'm going to kind of unify that in that informal and formal practice. It's all practice and it's all part of life and all contributing to living a more mindful life. So the formal practice of it through different meditative exercises, for instance, the ones that are taught during the mindfulness-based stress reduction course that was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, includes body scan, awareness of breath, mindful movement, inclusive of walking and eating mindfully. These practices and the formal practices of mindfulness in general largely originated over 4,000 years ago through Buddhist spiritual practices. However, practicing mindfulness does not automatically make you Buddhist or change your chosen faith somehow. So I want to just name that very explicitly. And as I mentioned in the yoga episode, there's also cultural appropriation found within many of the contemplative practices of the world. And in order to be more mindful, we do need to practice, because the 21st century is built in a way that is not so conducive to fostering our ability to be mindful.
And Shauna Shapiro, who I talk about often, talks about what you practice grows stronger. And so practicing mindfulness, you're growing your mindfulness practice. And a little nudge to join us at Green Gulch and actually practice with us, because it's an opportunity to practice in community, which we don't have that often, in actual community in the same room or under the same canopy of trees. And when you practice with others and you learn all these different ways of practicing, you'll find something that works for you. And it's a way to make that practicing easier. And so, especially if you don't have a practice that's working for you, coming and joining us and practicing with us will be really powerful. I think many people think they can't join us because they're not mindful healers yet, or they don't have an established mindfulness practice, or we might judge how mindful or not mindful you are, and that these programs and retreats are really for people who figured it out. But that's not true. They're actually to help you figure it out. I also wanted to reflect that you mentioned in the yoga episode, sometimes people have this conflict between religion and mindfulness,
Yeah.
and that practicing mindfulness doesn't have to be religious at all. It's a practice, as I mentioned in the yoga episode, of slowing down, of breathing. You could, if you are in medicine, think about it as a nervous system practice, a helping to balance your sympathetic nervous system, for example. And so if your religious background and training there makes it hard, you might want to think about it in more of a physiologic way rather than a philosophic way, because sometimes we all have our little crack that lets the light in, that helps us do something that's good for us. And maybe that will help some of you.
And also, most of the major, if not all of the major religions of the world have some sort of contemplative practice as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just to name that as well.
Well,
And
and prayer is actually a form of mindfulness. And so many people who have a religious spiritual practice actually already practice. We often just don't identify it. I mean, brushing your teeth can be a practice of mindfulness if you identify it to be that. So you can take some practice that you already have that's contemplative and identify it as mindfulness. And you may even get more benefit just acknowledging that that's what you're doing.
so you talked a lot about practice. So similarly, when we want to become more physically fit, we exercise, and usually in order to achieve that goal, more than one session is needed and repetition is needed. We can't just read about exercise. Similarly to not just reading about mindfulness, we actually need to intentionally practice it and experience it.
And
Mindfulness.
I'm just thinking too, this idea of exercise has to be done regularly. And so it's not something that you like, oh, I learned how to ski and I'll know forever, right? You have to keep practicing. And so it is something that can be a daily practice or some kind of regular practice. I find that people get out of practice, just like they've gotten out of perhaps their exercise routine. And Shauna Shapiro always talks about begin again. So you just begin again and you restart, just like you go back to exercise if you have gotten off course.
And you can begin again at any time, in this next moment, this next breath,
Yeah.
tomorrow, next year. It's up to you. So mindfulness can therefore be thought like exercise for the brain. It enables our minds and bodies to be together at the same place at the same time. And so I want to go a little bit more into the actual practice of it, like what are the exercises that are considered quote unquote more formal actually doing. So when we practice, for instance, awareness of breath or body scan meditation practice, you choose a focus of attention. Oftentimes it's the breath or a body part. So there can be different alternative anchors of attention, especially if the breath is triggering, like for some of my pulmonary patients, focusing on the breath can actually increase anxiety. But there are neutral anchors of attention that can be offered, like the sensations of the hands or the feet. So ultimately, your focus of attention can really be anything. And inevitably, because we are human, our mind will wander with thoughts, other body sensations, emotions. And when we practice and connect in nature, like outside, sounds, and all of that, it's okay. Like, let's normalize mind wandering. That's how our human brains were wired. But we can choose to train, just like we train in physical exercise. We can train our minds, our mindfulness muscle, to come back to the original focus of attention over and over again without judgment, without getting caught up into the sticky storylines of some of our thoughts. We can let our thoughts pass through the sky like clouds or like leaves floating down a stream. So, this idea of quote unquote clearing the mind is actually a myth, a misnomer in mindfulness. We're actually not trying to do that at all. We're simply trying to provide space to enable ourselves to be present with whatever is arising, even if they are sticky thoughts, all without judgment in the present moment, such that we might be able to choose healthier responses. I also wanted to point out that the word mindfulness in general can be triggering to some healers for similar reasons that were brought up in the yoga episode. Earlier efforts to curb healthcare professional burnout included mindfulness programs. They were almost rolled out like some sort of panacea for system-wide cure of burnout. Or
In
yes,
fact,
there's
we were deficient if we weren't mindful, right? That
right,
was a very judgmental, which is very anti-mindfulness.
right, and that if you practiced and learned how to be mindful, you were going to somehow be immune to the broken healthcare system.
Not be burnt out if you were mindful.
Right. When, yes, there's literature to suggest that the more mindful a physician is, there is decreases in burnout symptoms, for instance. So yes, it can be part of our way to help reduce the risk of burnout. But as we all know, and as we have been saying this whole time of the duration of this entire podcast since its inception, that the healthcare system is broken and it can't just fall upon the shoulders of healthcare professionals taking yoga classes and taking mindfulness classes on top of everything that we're already expected to do in our busy clinical days, especially. So
but they do help.
they absolutely
Better
do.
for us.
But I almost am, actually not almost, I am saddened at the way that mindfulness programs were rolled out in healthcare systems around the country, because they weren't presented in a way that was conducive to true healing of the system. It was almost also like a band-aid, because we weren't given protected time, space, or even resources to enable us to have any bandwidth at all in adopting and truly integrating mindfulness into our lives, and therefore the ways that we heal.
My healthcare system offered this class that they paid for, but you had to be there at 7 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. to do it before work, which is just made your day longer.
Yeah, and so no wonder, like, mindfulness, the word, can be triggering for some healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
So just like we alluded already to brushing our teeth, just like brushing our teeth, it takes time to do that. It takes time to prevent a cavity, even if it's just 2 minutes twice a day of brushing our teeth. So I feel like mindfulness can be approached similarly. Yes, some of the formal practices in mindfulness can take time if you choose to do so, but your informal practices and the informal practices that enable us to live more mindfully are all of those tiny little moments added together that can make a huge difference. Simply washing dishes mindfully, simply noticing the sensations of the soap suds and the water and the way that the dish feels in our hands, even washing our hands with the alcohol gel, donning and doffing our PPE during the heightened times of the COVID pandemic, for instance, taking stethoscope breaths. Even though I'm a pulmonologist and I'm very biased that the lung sounds are the most important part of the physical exam, that's a time where you can also take some mindful breaths with your patients. Walking from one hospital room or clinic room to another. And then the one that I like from Dr. Ron Epstein, who was with Dr. McCrasner, one of the pioneers of really bringing mindfulness into the clinical space. The doorknob approach is you take a mindful moment, notice the sensations of a doorknob before you walk into the room to be with your next patient, ready for that next encounter. And so being mindful truly can become incorporated into our day-to-day lives because it truly is a way of being. And to give you an example, when I met John Kabat-Zinn recently at University of Arizona during one of the conferences, when he gave his talk and guided us in a practice, he mentions not using a bell, for instance, to begin and end practice because all of it is just part of living. Like there is no beginning and end to practicing mindfulness. It's all embedded in life.
I love that. And I think that's how I guess we've just talked at length about how a yoga class has a beginning and end. But I approach mindfulness as a way of living and actually an approach to life. Shauna Shapiro actually talks about it as intention, attention, and attitude, which is the way you approach something. But I think it really is a way of living and being. And I often talk about those tenets of mindfulness. And I think if you're thinking about it as an approach, for some people who are saying, well, I can't practice mindfulness, or why I'm not mindful, I haven't succeeded at this, focusing on a bit of the intellectual approach to it, I have found for many people who struggle is a way in. And so I wanted to reflect on those. We've talked about them a few times in this podcast, but awareness or noticing is a way of being mindful. Patience is a way of being mindful. Non-judgment is a way of being mindful. Non-striving is a way of being mindful. And John Kabat-Zinn has his version and other people have slightly different versions. I'm going to say a few more, and I think you had some more that as I was brainstorming, couldn't remember all of them. So intention and attention. So what we pay attention to is our life. And so if you think about mindfulness that way, it's choosing what you pay attention to. Are you going to notice the scarcity, or are you going to notice what's wrong? Or are you going to focus on the positive? In healthcare, we're trained to focus on the negative. So being mindful might be just shifting your attention slightly. Compassion, key one that most of us really struggle with. Trust, something else we struggle with. Letting go. And presence is one I wanted to reflect on because I really loved this conversation I had with Shauna Shapiro at one point, and we were talking about joy and how we talk about joy in medicine. And in my experience, everyone wants joy, and every healthcare institution wants us to bring joy. And I struggle a bit with this idea of, well, a lot of what we do in medicine is not joyful. And the idea is that presence is what enables joy. So those moments of joy, which do come in medicine, it's just not all joyful, can only come if you're present. Otherwise, we miss them. And so I think when we're in this urgency moment or urgency approach and we're not being patient and present, we miss it. And so you can have joy, is what she always explains, by washing dishes. While you're washing dishes, you can find joy if you're present. You can have joy. In her book, she talks about exploring ants with her son and how he is finding joy in watching the ants if you set that as your intention and you're present. Whereas if you're thinking we should be at the beach right now and this was not what I planned, then you'll miss out on that joy. And so it's really helpful for many folks to really take these intentions and attitudes of mindfulness and use them. If you're struggling to have a mindfulness practice, you can get in a little bit more intellectually and philosophically to get started.
Yeah, what's the way in? To round it out for, it's going to be beyond 9 attitudes mindfulness, but there's also beginner's mind. So approaching every circumstance as if for the first time to get a fresh perspective, a fresh outlook. The other attitude is acceptance. So not a resignation type of acceptance, but simply allowing this present moment to be just as it is because it's already here. And
Not resisting reality.
right. There's a lot of suffering when we resist what's already here in the present moment. Then there's generosity and gratitude. So generosity in not material things necessarily, but in our energy, in our presence. Maybe that's why presence is a homonym for presence with a TS. Generosity of spirit.
I like to think of generosity of storytelling, telling good stories, assuming good intent.
Yeah. And with gratitude, being grateful for everything that is happening in this particular moment.
So my invitation as we get to the end is to, if you struggle with mindfulness, keep it simple. So 5 minutes can make a difference. If 5 minutes is too hard, 1 minute can make a difference. And the non-judgment there, use an app, lie on the ground under the trees, forest bathe, be in nature. I think it requires pause and presence, but you can do that anywhere and in zillions of different ways. And so where I get into trouble is when I start to judge. I wasn't here long enough. I didn't spend enough time. I didn't practice today. Well, practice right here, right now, in that moment. And that could be amazing. The other place that I think gets us into trouble is that we think if we're mindful, it's going to solve everything. And mindfulness is one piece. And so mindfulness doesn't cure burnout alone. Yoga doesn't cure burnout alone. Even the healthcare system getting fixed isn't going to cure burnout alone. It's really all of these things work together in this fabric. What we do in medicine is very complex. And so having different tools is very complex. I like to point out, though, that I think these tools are synergistic. And in the coaching world, and as many of you know, that's what I do primarily, I think if you coach without mindfulness, you end up judging yourself and you end up using willpower. And where the yoga and the mindfulness and these approaches and attitudes actually allow you to do these changes, whether they're to work in medicine or choose an intentional mindset with much more ease and grace. And that if we can think of them all as different tools to try to weave into our fabric of being a human in a human life, which always involves challenges, I think that's where you can just dip a toe in and begin.
So as we like to close our episodes, we'll end with some reflection questions. What are your thoughts about mindfulness? Inviting you to notice any judgment that arises and how you might practice it or live your life mindfully or not mindfully. What's preventing you from including mindfulness in your healing of yourself and others? And how can you integrate mindfulness into your own day-to-day life?
And if you want help integrating mindfulness into your own day-to-day life, join us on our retreat because it's fun. And that's something that we work on. And you will be so happy that you did. And we will be so happy to meet you in person. You can also invite one or both of us to come talk to your group about the realities of mindfulness and the realities of practicing mindfulness, and a bit of the approach we talked about here about how might we bring mindfulness into healthcare in healthy, non-judgmental ways, and how might we weave it into the fabric of what we do in medicine in ways that are healthy for patients and healthy for those people practicing medicine in the system as it is today. Thanks so much for joining us, and a nudge to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts so that other people can find us and learn how they might practice mindfulness in their own lives. We'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely. Welcome to today's mindful moment offering, inviting you to close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you, if it's safe for you to do so. Inviting you to bring your attention to the breath at the nostrils. And if you find that focusing on your breath is overwhelming for you, then you can simply choose different anchors of attention, like the sensations of the hands or the support of the ground beneath your feet. Noticing the in-breath at the nostrils, the out-breath, and the pause in between. Not trying to change any aspect of your breath, but simply noticing it for what it is right here, right now. And if thoughts, other body sensations, or emotions have captured your attention, simply acknowledge that this mind wandering is part of the human experience and is very normal. But you can choose to bring your attention back to your breath at the nostrils. Noticing this breath and this. And this one. And as you're ready, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in, taking a moment now to notice how you feel compared to just a few minutes ago. Thanks so much for practicing with me.